Apologies there, our audio did not come through. We are now in day 7 of what is the national mourning period for Georgia's son, President Jimmy Carter, and we have team coverage for you starting right now as we take you out to the Carter Center. But before we do that, Joy, I wanted to walk folks through what today looks like for President Carter as he makes his way from the Carter Center, where the public here in Atlanta was able to say their goodbyes and visit as he lied in repose, now making his way here in an hour to Washington, D.C.
That's right. And, and that's really big picture. What is happening today is that, we had our period here in Georgia where the late president was lying in repose in the Carter Center, something that he actually wished for so that more people would have the chance to say their goodbyes. And also because of the significance of the Carter Center to him and his life and his legacy. But we have to remember he's not just Georgia's president, as beloved as he is, as much of a hometown hero as he is, he is a world figure, and his remains will be taken to the nation's capital to lie in state at the Capitol Rotunda, being a former president, and of course a grand ceremony surrounding all of this, a little bit altered because of the weather, the wintry weather that has been affecting our nation's capital, but the departure ceremony beginning just about an hour from now at 11 a.m. From the Carter Presidential Center, and that will involve a motorcade departing for Dobbins Air Reserve Base. Around 11:30 is when that's anticipated to happen. And then the late president and his family are expected to arrive at Dobbins Air Reserve Base a little bit after noon today, and board Special Air Mission 39 after an arrival ceremony. And that aircraft will depart to Washington, D.C., our nation's capital. It will actually arrive at Joint Base Andrews, which of course is in Maryland, before Mr. Carter's remains will be transferred with a ceremony, of course, to the hearse a little bit after 2 o'clock today. And then we can expect a motorcade around 2:45. Shortly before 3 o'clock, departing for the U.S. Navy Memorial. And that is when Mr. Carter's remains are going to be transferred from a hearse to a horse-drawn carriage with a ceremony upon arrival at the U.S. Naval Memorial at around 3:30. And then the funeral procession is expected to begin around 3:45 today, marching up to the U.S. Capitol. And of course, the ultimate goal is that for today is that Mr. Carter's remains will be taken to the Capitol Rotunda to lie in state so that mourners from around the nation can come and pay their respects.
And just ahead of that, all of this starting at the Carter Center, and that's where we find our Atlanta News First reporter, Sarah Hammond. And Sarah, can you hear us all right?
I can hear you.
We know
standing in front of the circle of. Sorry, go ahead.
We know that this timeline of events today starts at the Carter Center. There will be a departure ceremony there. What can you tell us about what's currently going on as these preparations get underway?
Right, so we are in front of the circle of flags here at the Carter Center. We're waiting on the motorcade to arrive here. There's going to be a brief ceremony at 11 o'clock before former President Jimmy Carter leaves this place that he called his home away from home in Atlanta for one final time. I want you guys to see we have some members, some representatives from the Carter Center out here right now waiting for that motorcade, waiting for President Carter to come outside and be taken from here for the final time.
Yeah, and Sarah, all of this was pushed back 90 minutes due to weather delays. Currently trying to move this mourning plan along. With that in mind, we know that this is going to take place at about 11. Have you had a chance to talk to some of the folks that came out here during the final period of that public mourning during the repose?
We did. So, that public viewing ended officially at 7 o'clock this morning at the Carter Center. There have been a huge number of flowers, messages, and flags placed here at the sign at the Carter Center at one of the gates here. And we know now that more than 23 1,000 people came through here between Saturday night to 7 o'clock this morning. And amongst them, we have seen tears, we have heard stories, we've heard a lot of thank yous to the former president, and people who went inside there tell us that the experience was deeply moving, because as you go through, you start and you are able to go through the museum here at the Carter Center, and you really see his life from starting from a peanut farmer in Plains to his rise to President of the United States, before you round that corner and see his casket lying there draped with the American flag. So of course that evoked a lot of emotions here. But again, now that public viewing period is over, we are again waiting for the motorcade to arrive here. The family will arrive here. That's going to start, or they're going to get here at about 11 o'clock, and that ceremony will start at 11:30 before they head to Dobbins Air Reserve Base to head to Washington, D.C. Like you said, a lot of this, the timing was pushed back a little bit for some of that weather they're seeing up in D.C.
Atlanta News First, Sarah Hammond joining us here on ANF+. Sarah, thank you so much. We will check back in with you once that departure ceremony does begin, and we'll continue our coverage on air and online. Joy, I want to talk a little bit about that weather with you. We have Atlanta News First Alert meteorologist Ella Dorsey, who will be joining to break some of that down.
Yeah.
But here's a live picture, as we can see outside Washington, D.C., outside of the White House, and you can see some of that snow and impacts. They just got out of what I believe was a blizzard. The weather conditions improving slightly from what we saw over the past few days, but still enough to cause some of those delays with the national day that is the national couple days that folks in D.C., folks up north will have a chance to visit President Carter as he lies in repose there, followed by a national funeral, of course. But it's, it is one of those things where they are doing their best, understanding those conditions, to move things along for President Carter before he returns to us here in Georgia on Thursday for a service out of his hometown of Plains.
Yes, and when we look at that shot, I mean, it is beautiful. It does look like a winter wonderland, but the impacts are actually have really disrupted things in our nation's capital. So this major winter storm dropped between 6 to 10 inches in various, depending on where you are actually in the capital area. So it's really created a lot of issues. A lot of school districts in the Washington, D.C. area were closed yesterday and will actually be closed again today, many of them. Hundreds of flights have been canceled. The local Metro Rail service was somewhat interrupted. The Metro bus service, I should say, it was reduced as a result of that. And, obviously major winter storm warning for that area. And, of course, people are being encouraged to stay off the roads. And, there were some road closures as a result. And again, all the flight cancellations. So really not the best time to travel. And that certainly did impact the plans to transport the remains of our late and great president, Mr. Carter, to the nation's capital. But that ceremony will continue on today, a little bit of an altered timeline, but again, the goal is that he will ultimately lie in repose at the Capitol Rotunda for people from all around the nation to gather and pay their respects. I will say that around 6 p.m. there's going to be private family time there. Mm-hmm. And then things will open up to the public 8:30 tonight until midnight, and of course he will lie in repose there as well tomorrow, before Thursday, making his way the remains making his way back to his hometown in Plains, Georgia.
Yeah, certainly. And, I just want to take folks out. This was earlier before that repose period closed at 7 o'clock this morning, that folks were able to come out and say their goodbyes. And we saw the line that was forming, people around Atlanta, people coming in, some outside of the state even, to pay their respects and say goodbye. This is some of that coverage that we're showing you here. Again, not live, but I'll throw up a bug there so you could see. That was a very special period for us here in Atlanta, and so special that it started here in Atlanta and will continue on to Washington, D.C. before the funeral service and final goodbyes out in Plains to close it all out. But I got to actually speak to a couple folks that were able to make it out to the repose, and they said how quiet and mindful everybody was, and it was very clearly a sense of reflection and appreciation in the air, and a deep admiration from everyone at the Carter Center, of course, who is dedicated much of their life to honoring the life and legacy of both Jimmy and former First Lady and his beloved late wife, Rosalind Carter.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And, you know, we see here at some point the changing of the guard ceremony as, you know, Mr. Carter is being given the highest honors possible, not only in life as a Nobel Peace Prize winner, but in death. And, you know, this is why the remembrances are spanning this length of time of several days to give folks the chance here in Georgia, have had their opportunity over the last few days to come and pay their respects and say goodbye to the only president from Georgia. But again, he went on to become a world leader. And so, you know, the grand ceremony to transport his remains to our nation's capital later on today. And, you know, just as we've seen, the appropriate level of respect really given and honors to Mr. Carter in his remembrances here in Georgia. We're going to see much of that in our nation's capital. You know, I mentioned the funeral procession beginning a little bit before 4 o'clock at 3:45 with marching up to the U.S. Capitol. And then upon arrival, a little after 4 o'clock, we can expect to see the late president carried up the stairs by military body bearers into the rotunda. And Congress will be paying their respects during a special service at the rotunda at 4:30 this afternoon. And, you know, that will be followed by the private family time, which I mentioned before things open up to the public, because as we know, I mean, Mr. Carter was very much a family man, and it seems that, you know, part of the reason why he's so beloved and so revered was not just because of his achievements in the public realm, in the political realm, but as a family man, as a beloved husband, father, you know, his not just romance, but love and commitment to his late wife, Rosalind, something that really captured hearts all around Georgia and beyond. And we've seen such a close-knit family. You know, we've heard from his grandson, Jason Carter, his son, Chip Carter, remarking about what it was like to have him as a father and a grandfather, and really to get a front row seat to history, and to see how he carried that sort of leadership, that loving but strong leadership within their family, to the public realm, going on to make great change, you know, not just in his work in term after the office, you know, fighting guinea worm and river blindness, his work for Habitat Humanity, but in office, both as governor and as president. One of the things that he is so respected for and celebrated for were his great efforts to create diversity and inclusion. Here in Georgia, in our local government and in the U.S. government. And actually, you know, he was the first president to create an Asian American Pacific Heritage period as well. And there's just an example of some of what he's done to...
So ahead of his time.
Yes, absolutely. And credited with hiring more women and minorities than his predecessors here in Georgia, and really helping to break some barriers and glass ceilings.
Certainly. I want to take folks back out to the Carter Center for a moment as we look back at these past couple days. Since Saturday, folks have been able to say their farewells here in Atlanta. Our Atlanta News First reporter, Patrick Quinn, has a look at what that meant to some of the folks that spoke to us, reflecting on the visitation.
20,000 people have visited the Carter Center to mourn the loss of the former president.
Emotional. Very emotional, very heavy. Everyone here, it felt like your uncle died.
We talked with those like Karen moments after they made their way through the Carter Center library as the former president laid in repose.
He touched everybody. Every culture, Jamaican, Haitian, Chinese, India, America, Switzerland. I was like, this was Mr. United.
For Karen Daly, President Jimmy Carter was Mr. Georgia first and foremost. For Steve Bergathon, whose daughter now serves in the U.S. Navy, Carter's commitment to country, especially after his presidency, will forever stand out.
Stood there for a half hour, went through about 5 boxes of Kleenexes.
Georgians are coming out to really say goodbye to President Carter.
Carter Center CEO Paige Alexander told me they, of course, will no longer be a founder-driven organization. But after the president is laid to rest Thursday in Plains, the Carter Center will carry on. And President Carter and former First Lady Rosalynn Carter's legacy will dictate their direction.
Our work will continue. They set a North Star of global health and peace and conflict resolution, and that's what we'll continue to do in their legacy.
On Thursday, the Carter Center will reopen its doors to the public, free admission on the National Day of Mourning of President Carter. With a tear down her cheek, Karen told me she'll be back to honor the past and the president.
It's about to get very real because now our elder presidents are now dying off with a piece of history from them. So this monument that they did is beautifully done.
Patrick Quinn, Atlanta News First.
And well said, in that message echoing for so many who have made this visit and who have watched our coverage here. I want to take you now out to Washington, D.C. This is a look at some of the weather conditions that we are dealing with and why we are now seeing, at this point, a 90-minute delay to the Day 7 service and procession for President Carter as he makes his way to our nation's capital. I want to bring in Atlanta News First Alert meteorologist Ella Dorsey with a look at that forecast out in D.C.
Oh my goodness. Hello. Okay, so guys, yesterday in D.C., they saw a pretty significant winter storm. Give me just a second here. So they saw freezing rain between 3 and 4, which coated the roadways. And then on top of that, they got 6 to 10 inches of snow, which in Atlanta would completely shut down the entire state, in Georgia as well. But in D.C., they're more well prepared for that. I was up there last year in January, and there was like 4 or 5 inches of snow on the ground, and people were just going about like it was completely fine. But still, because of the ice and the snow, major roads are cleared, but back roads are still a concern there today. So the current temperature is 28 degrees, which means it's still below freezing. So a lot of that ice and snow is still on the ground. It is just cold all over, really. Here's a look at the current radar. They're under clear skies up there in D.C. There's definitely some snow showers to the south or to the north. You can just see it's just kind of cold. It feels like winter. Here are the temperatures in D.C. today. Really, it's going to stay in the 30s through most of the afternoon. So it's still going to be a really cold day up there for the procession. However, most of that snow, again, probably going to melt, but it's still quite breezy today. Very similar to the day that we're having here. That's what they're going to experience up there in D.C. today. So certainly cold. On Thursday, when President Carter comes back to Plains, Georgia, this is the forecast in Plains, Georgia, it will be chilly, upper 40s with sunny skies. So that will be quite nice for the weather there on Thursday. So overall, it feels like winter. Of course, here, all eyes are on the incoming winter storm this weekend, but that will not have an impact on the weather in D.C. Today or tomorrow. And that is what I have for you for the forecast there and here. Very similar day, the heart of winter, but everyone's hearts are still warm, right? Remembering President Carter.
All right, just wanted to bring in our First Alert meteorologist, Ella Dorsey, just with contextualizing what is ahead still for President Carter. Again, as we continue to mourn what is Georgia's only president, a beloved man here in the Peach State. And of course, we will continue to bring you live coverage of each day as we continue to take you through today, which is going to be the procession route from Carter Center to Washington, D.C., and that includes what will be an arrival ceremony at the Carter Center, followed by a departure all the way up to Dobbins Air Reserve, where the president and members who are overseeing the protection of his casket will fly to D.C. Again, the Carter family following in tow to Washington, D.C., where a national funeral will be held with remarks from President Biden and a public mourning period as the president as the former president, I should say, lies in repose at the nation's U.S. Capitol. We will bring you that live coverage right here on Atlanta News First Plus. Taking a live look right now outside at Washington, D.C., as you can see the snow on the ground and some of those conditions not looking too great in the past few days, but as Ella indicated, showing some improvement enough for them to be able to push this plan for today by 90 minutes and continue along. Again, that arrival ceremony at Carter Center beginning at 11 a.m. We are going to bring you that right here on Atlanta News First Plus, but we wanted to take this time ahead of that to look back at Jimmy Carter's life in his own words.
Nice.
I'm running for president. I will faithfully execute
the office of President of the United States.
the office of President of the United States.
Our social and political progress has been based on one fundamental principle: the value and importance of the individual.
There's a new mood in America.
I say to you quite frankly that the time for racial discrimination is over.
Let us learn together and laugh together and work together.
We must accommodate changing times in which we are involved right this moment, but we must cling to principles that never change. I didn't ask God to let me live, but I just asked God to give me a proper attitude toward death. And I found that I was absolutely and completely at ease with death.
You know, I've had a wonderful life. I've had thousands of friends, and I've had an exciting and adventurous and gratifying existence.
The great principles that have guided this nation since its very founding will continue to guide America through the challenges of the future. I've wanted to serve as president because I love this country and because I love the people of this nation.
I love this country and I love the people of this nation. And so well said. I mean, that transcended past his time in the White House. He really went on to showcase his humanitarian side, his fight for rights around the globe, and his care right here for the folks in Plains, through being a Sunday school teacher,
Yes.
through being an avid community member. He really did dedicate 100 years of life to giving back to his community through and through.
Yeah, it is incredible. And, you know, we've heard in the last few days from residents here in Georgia who had their homes built in part by Mr. and Mrs. Carter through their efforts through Habitat for Humanity. They built thousands of homes, and you saw them hands-on, you know, with the blue hard hat, getting his hands dirty just like a peanut farmer from Plains, Georgia would. And, you know, you're right. I mean, he lived a life of service. And also is something that we've talked about a little bit is that he shared his life. You know, I think we were discussing a little bit earlier about how sometimes when folks are ailing or aging, they may shy away from the limelight, and that's certainly understandable. But Mr. Carter could be seen with a black eye from a fall out there building homes.
The next day after taking a fall. Yeah, it was incredible. I actually have a story from our team here about his time working with Habitat for Humanity, this fantastic organization that he actually built over 500 homes for with his own hands.
It is incredible, and you know, and I believe they were actually, the Carters were involved in thousands more beyond that. Of course, you know, physically building thousands of homes himself, that might not be possible really for anyone, but you know, he was physically involved. He was, of course, in terms of the strategy of the development of affordable housing for so many Georgians and really beyond. And we've seen some of, in the last few days, some members of the communities come forward and opening up their homes to us to show, how grateful they are that they were given the opportunity to provide a safe place for their children, for their loved ones, despite, maybe having a bit of a lower income. And it's something that really was personal for Mr. Carter. He is actually the only president to have lived in public subsidized housing himself. So clearly understood the importance of having safe, affordable housing, regardless of how much money you might have.
One of the most significant contributions of the late former President Jimmy Carter is his dedication to Habitat for Humanity, building homes for disadvantaged people while advocating for affordable housing. Habitat CEO Jonathan Reckford says President Carter's work with the group, which was founded near Carter's home in Georgia, started in 1980, but quickly grew several years later.
President and Mrs. Carter and a busload of volunteers from South Georgia went up to New York City to rehab a tenement building on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And that's really when the world found out about Habitat.
That New York project helped inspire the Carter Work Project, which has since built thousands of homes for people in need.
The Carter Project really is our signature vehicle for bringing attention to the need for safety and affordable housing. And so every year they personally would come and build somewhere in the world.
Carter was always hands-on in his work with Habitat. He volunteered on work sites physically building houses well into his 90s.
He has a legendary work ethic and is actually a very skilled carpenter. Everyone, of course, wanted to be on the Carter house at the Carter build. And I always tell people, it is an honor, but it's also a stressful environment because you never want to be slacking off.
Reckford recalls when Carter fell ahead of a build in Nashville in 2019 that landed him in the hospital.
And of course, we were panicked and so worried about him being okay. And then I got a rather grumpy call from him saying, I'm fine. I'll see you there. And he shows up and he's got a bandage on his head and a big black eye and builds all week at the age of 95.
Even with his passing, Jimmy Carter's legacy to Habitat for Humanity will live on forever. And where would Habitat for Humanity be without the work of President Carter?
I think it's hard to imagine, but it's hard to imagine it would have grown so big globally and so broad.
These Habitat for Humanity homes are just a few miles from the White House, and while Jimmy Carter only served one 4-year term as president, these homes may be a more permanent legacy for Carter as a volunteer and humanitarian. In Washington, I'm Stetson Miller.
And it's exactly as you said, Joy. He would take a fall one day and be up and building houses the next. It's truly remarkable. And so many people, for them, that resonated with a man who lived for the service of others. And he said himself in one of his final interviews that he wanted to be known as a humanitarian, as a human rights advocate. And he dedicated his life through that in action, not just words.
Right. And he wasn't just, in terms of policy, advocating for these things in an ivory tower, although he could, as one of the most powerful people in the world, a president and then a former president. I mean, he was hands-on, he was getting down and dirty, and, he wanted to be a part of making the world a better place any way he could.
And that's part of why today is such an honor for us here in Georgia, as we truly say our final goodbyes before sending him off to the national stage. This is the timeline starting at 11 o'clock. That arrival ceremony at the Carter Center, followed by a motorcade, which will depart from the Carter Center and head to Dobbins Air Reserve Base. And that is really where we see him for the final time before his return on Thursday in Plains. So Dobbins Air Reserve Base will be holding a departure ceremony for the 39th president, during which they will pay their final honors as he is loaded onto the plane and that plane takes off. And we're going to see that through and through. I actually want to bring in now Atlanta News First political reporter Doug Reardon, who is out at Dobbins Air Reserve Base. And Doug, just want to make sure you can hear us all right.
Yeah, I can hear you just fine. Good morning, Maria.
Good morning. So, you are out at Dobbins Air Reserve Base. This is really going to be the final stopping point here in Georgia before President Carter takes to the skies and goes to Washington, D.C., where the nation will have a chance to mourn him the way we got to this past Saturday.
Yes, and while we always say that Jimmy Carter is one of the favorite sons of Georgia, we don't share our admiration for him. And so this plane will take him to Washington, D.C., where he will lie in state for the final part of all this ceremony that has gone over the last couple of days. And real quick, I want to show you this plane that's going to be taking him, because we were able to find it. If we can see it through the fence here, that's the plane there, that distinctive blue and white plane with the American flag on the tail. Looks very similar to Air Force One or Air Force Two. But today we'll be flying for Special Mission 39. Of course, Jimmy Carter, the 39th President of the United States. It's going to leave here sometime around 11:30 a.m. and arrive at Joint Base Andrews in Maryland. It's not far from Washington, D.C., and so once that plane lands, Carter's casket will be escorted off of it and taken on a couple different routes. One that will lead him by the Naval Memorial. Of course, he had a very illustrious career in the Navy as a nuclear submarine member, and it will also then take him by horse-drawn carriage to the Capitol, where he will be placed in the rotunda, where people will be able to see him for several days before he makes his way back here to Georgia, and we'll be down in Plains for that. Now, I do want to make one mention very quickly of how this is going to maybe impact people, even if they're not going to see Carter in Washington, D.C. The day of his funeral, that will be this Thursday, so 2 days from now, will be a national day of mourning. And so that means that all executive and most government agencies are going to be shut down. That includes the U.S. Post Office. That's going to include administrative offices at a lot of national parks. And so just wanting people to understand the impacts, even if they're just going to watch this from home on TV, a lot of those government agencies are going to be shut down for that National Day of Mourning, as Jimmy Carter is mourned both in Washington, D.C. and then later on in the day in Plains, Georgia.
And Doug, I know you'll be there every step of the way to take us through the coverage at Dobbins Air Reserve Base. I wanted to actually ask you, you were in Plains, the hometown of President Carter, just a few days ago, talking to some of the folks down there. They are going to get a chance to have their own service and really time with President Carter before he is buried in his backyard under a willow tree, as he always intended. Talk to me about the feeling in Plains now that someone so near and dear to the town has passed.
Yeah, I go back to, there was this one moment when Carter had just entered hospice where we were talking to members of his beloved Maranatha Baptist Church, where he attended for many years, right up until around COVID, when they just couldn't bring him there anymore for health reasons. But we had asked one of the elders there, what happens to Plains after Jimmy Carter passes away and is no longer here to be the shepherd for that city? And she said, I don't know. I think it's a bit of a mystery even to folks down there how that legacy continues and what it's going to look like after people will show up to Plains knowing that Jimmy Carter won't be there. He was the type of guy who you could catch riding his bike down the street to go get ice cream on any given day, or would come into the local diner and shake hands and meet people and just sit down and have a meal. And so that was always the allure of Plains, was that he was there keeping that legacy alive. And so it's a little bit of a mystery, I think, for the people there as to how the dynamic of that very sleepy, small, but very interesting and educational place is going to play out after Carter's death. But one thing is for sure, his handprints are all over that place. It is basically a living museum to his life. So we also learned this week that his home where he lived with Rosalind Carter as most of their marriage of 77 years, that is going to be turned into a public museum similar to his boyhood farm, a national park. So people will be able to go see how the Carters lived both before and after their time in the White House, and they will also be able to visit that burial site once Jimmy Carter arrives back in Plains and they get that process of opening it up to the public.
Doug Reardon, our political reporter here at Atlanta News First, thank you so much for your time. And Joy, I actually want to bring you into this conversation too. You know, Plains is such a special place for Jimmy Carter throughout the course of his life, and now it will be the final resting place for him as he makes his way back from Washington, D.C. I don't want to look too far ahead, but I do want to talk about that. Thursday is what will be a shorter procession a funeral service, as Doug had mentioned, at Maranatha Baptist Church, where he taught for so many years, where he attended. And that really will be the last final chance for Georgia to have this time with the 39th president.
Right, and by all accounts, Maranatha Baptist Church is a smaller church, and it's a small community. But certainly of huge significance, and really over the past few days, what we understand is that folks have been descending on planes, paying their respects, remembering, honoring the life of the late former president, and also stopping by Maranatha Baptist Church as well. And as Doug mentioned, the former president taught Sunday school services for as long as he physically could, until his health really got the better of him in that regard. And very much was about his roots, really acknowledged that his hometown of Plains, Georgia shaped who he was. It's the town where he began his life, and it is the town where he chose to return and live until the day that he died. And we've talked a lot about the significance of making his way back home, in this procession, in the afterlife, if you will. And so after lying in state in Washington, D.C., in our nation's capital, in the Capitol Rotunda, which will begin later today, after his remains make the journey there, ultimately a couple days from now on Thursday, that's what will happen. The motorcade returning Mr. Carter back to Plains, Georgia, to Maranatha Baptist Church for a private service in his home church, in his church, making a procession through Plains, a military style procession, before a private internment. And it sort of mirrors his life, of coming from a small town, descending to the greatest heights of political power to become a world leader, going to our nation's capital, and then coming back home, where he ultimately will rest.
Certainly.
And that's what these events really mirror, to show him being honored in after death, really in the way that he lived.
And the town of Plains having a moment to showcase their appreciation for the president. And as they'll say, the number one resident of Plains. Our Atlanta News First anchor, Sean Gables, takes a look at the hometown life of former President Jimmy Carter and how this shaped him as he went on to serve in the White House and really dedicate his life back to the nation and around the world.
It is in some ways the same now as it was 80 years ago. To stroll around downtown Plains in the 21st century is to walk virtually the same steps Jimmy Carter would have walked as a young boy. The same country roads and storefronts, the same farm on which Carter grew up, forever preserved as a National Historic Site.
This is where he lived from the age of 4.
With park rangers like Randy Dillard helping tell the Carter family story.
In 1928, they had no electricity or running water, so you see the outhouse here in the backyard. Of course, the Carters lived off the land.
For Jimmy and his siblings, it was a life of hard work. Their father Earl and mother Lillian demanded nothing less than a full day's labor on top of excellence in school and regular attendance at church. In the evening, if they wanted chicken for dinner, they had to go out back and catch one.
Growing up, President Carter thought...
Dillard says perhaps more important than the work ethic President Carter learned on his father's peanut farm were the character traits he developed. At a time when segregation was still the rule, Carter's parents went against the grain in what they taught Jimmy.
This place was very significant in the fact that as a young child, he would help his mother take care of the African-American residents in this area. And Miss Lillian taught all of her children to take care of those people.
They were the principles Carter took with him to the governor's chair at the Capitol, where in 1971, he announced in his inaugural speech that the time for discrimination in Georgia was over. And even as he ascended to the presidency of the United States, Carter never forgot where he came from. The experience he gained while serving on the school board in Sumter County helped pave the way for his career in politics and service to the world.
It's hard for me to say how much it must mean to him. The thought that he didn't think of going anywhere else when he retired from the presidency. From what he says, he just always wanted to come back to Plains.
Friends like Elaine Halgabook knew President Carter from their days as children. She recalls when he first asked her friend Rosalind Smith out for a date. Carter and Smith were engaged not long after. Their marriage, born in Plains.
We all knew each other from the beginning of our lives. We had to sort of pinch ourselves to realize that the Jimmy from Plains was the Jimmy in the White House.
Even she was surprised when in his later years, President Carter spent more and more time back home. He was often seen walking the streets of Plains with Rosalind.
We take for granted ability.
And he continued teaching Sunday school at his church until he was no longer able to serve. In the end, his life revolved around the town he treasured so deeply, the town that helped shape the man who would become president.
And we are back here live with our continuing coverage of former President Jimmy Carter as he is set to take off his remains to Washington, D.C. for the national mourning period where our nation will be able to pay their respects to a beloved president. You know, there's been a lot of coverage over the past few weeks, few days since the announcement on December 28th of President Carter's passing, Joy.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, you know, our Monica Pearson, of course, still active, though she doesn't need to be, but that's another person who's dedicated her life to serving the community, and got to speak with the grandson of the late former president about his life and legacy in an exclusive one-on-one.
When you walk in here, what are the memories that flow?
Well, I mean, this is like a family place for us in a lot of ways, right? I mean, this was the first place my grandfather ever had a political event outside of his home Senate district in Southwest Georgia, you know, and it's, I had my 21st birthday party here. We've had a ton of other birthdays. And, you know, when the Carter family and the Carter administration gets together, they have their reunions here, so.
So is this the reason his relationship with Manuel Maloof, who was then chair of the DeKalb County Commission and owned this facility, was that why the Carter Center was placed where it was, it is?
If you asked Jimmy Carter for a period of time why the Carter Center is where it is, he would have said to be next to Manuel's, for sure. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but that was the claim.
And he was a teetotaler.
Well, he wasn't. He wasn't a teetotaler. He wasn't. No, he would sip some champagne, and he make Bloody Marys in the mornings, and so he had a good time at Manuel's.
When I think about you and your grandfather, you were the first grandchild, and I have this wonderful picture in mind that the center provided that shows you and your Aunt Amy and your grandfather. He's standing on a tree stump. You're up in the tree with Amy. What are your other memories from the White House? You were so young.
I was young, but it's one of those like periods of time where, you know, I've talked about it so much throughout my life that I've kept them, you know, and Amy and I talk about it a little bit, and even lately. about the times I would go up there just to visit my grandparents. And they had that treehouse built at the White House for basically me and Amy, and my cousin James came soon after. But it was a place where we got together as a family, right? When just because they were living in the White House didn't mean they were different than any other grandparents. They had us up there, and we built snowmen, and we did Easter egg hunts and all that stuff. We just happened to do it on the White House lawn.
When I look at you in the photographs with your grandfather, the smiles are so similar.
His is a lot more famous than mine.
But what is it that his trait that you find in you?
It's funny because lately I've been thinking about the things that are different, right? He had this tireless energy, and I feel like I'm always tired these days. But I'm not the only one who was not able to keep up with Jimmy Carter, right, over time. I think there's the thing that I try to emulate is his respect for other people. And he never looked down on anybody, no matter what your job was, no matter where you came from, no matter your condition. And that's really what I try to do. I mean, I don't know that I'm as successful as him, but to me, if you ask what of him do I see in me, I would hope it's that.
And what about him, you would say, I'm not going to be like Grandpa on that one?
It's funny. We all talk about his integrity and about his honesty and how he really was the same person no matter who he was talking to or where he was or anything else. And I admire that. And I think even my grandmother would say sometimes he needed to curb that honesty a little bit. How do I look in this dress? And he would just be honest. And I think maybe I try to limit that a little bit.
What is the quality you took from your grandma?
She was just all love for people. She was just all love, and she was the rock of the family, and she was the best politician in the family, and so she really understood people, I think, in a way that sometimes he understood, concepts and policies and the engineering aspects of getting something done, but she was the one that could truly connect with somebody, and I think that partnership was so complementary and such a remarkable partnership that it really, it was this epic 77-year life of service that they lived together.
It's really hard when you are the spokesperson for the family, and at the same time, you are having to mourn not only the loss of your grandmother a year ago, and now the loss of your grandfather. So how is Jason taking care of himself?
These last few days, it's been really nice because it's just been logistics, right? These things came up. We have this massive funeral operation, which is a blessing for us, and it's a really wonderful way for us to celebrate alongside the American people, alongside people across the globe. We've appreciated that, and I really think it has also been a welcome distraction. A little bit, if I'm being honest, to do these things that we need to do, and then we'll have our chance to reflect. I did go by the Carter Center the other night after the processions had ended, and sat there as people were paying their respects, just my wife and I. And there's a little part of that room where you're not on camera. And so we sat in that little part of the room just for ourselves and had a moment. And, even then we were sharing him with the people that were coming through, but that was okay, right? That's how we always knew it was. And it was a nice moment for me and Kate.
I'm worried about when you're going to have time to mourn.
Well, I mean, look, we've got a lot of time. We've got a lot of time. And we have been preparing for this emotionally for a long time, right? One of the benefits of having 2 years almost in hospice care is we've had a chance to reflect and prepare. Of course, it's not the same, but we knew that he was at peace, and that helps us be at peace. And he was ready, as he said to us, to go be with Rosalind.
So how much was he involved in the planning of his funeral? And the reason I ask is Bernstein Hollis told me that 20 years ago he told her he wanted her to pray.
That's 100% true. when you live to be 100, you plan your funeral for a long time. And so he, they were involved in it. There's a piece of it, the interesting piece for us about a state funeral. As I understand this process, they only do this, a full state funeral, if you held the presidency, and that's pretty much it. Those are the people for whom this country does this. And so once he decided that we would have this state funeral, there were some pieces of it that they got to plan, and they put their minds together and they put it together. But it's a really interesting process that this is what we do, and we do it only for presidents.
Now, I know you're going to be speaking in Washington, but first I'm going to talk about your speech here to the Carter employees. You got a little emotional.
I was looking out at that room of people, and it is people who worked with him and really have given their lives to his legacy. And as we watched this human being, right, that we all knew as Pawpaw, we watched him grow and build this legacy. What we sometimes forget is, obviously he wasn't doing that alone, right? The Carter Center has 3,500 employees that are out there living out this legacy of Jimmy Carter. And so as I sat in that room and I looked out at some of those folks and saw the tears in their eyes, and really it's for the work that they do, I got choked up. But we share my grandfather, my family, with a variety of people, and I think the ones at the Carter Center that have worked with him for 40 years are the ones that really we feel the closest to.
Well, everybody wants to know how your dad Jack's doing, how Jeff and Chip and Amy are doing. How are they getting through this?
I think they're great. I mean, my dad is a caregiver right now in his life with his wife. And then Amy and Chip and Jeff and my Aunt Becky have really spent this last time for the last 22 months, going back and forth to Plains and really both connecting, but also feeling that burden of being caregivers, right, for my grandfather. And so I think as they've been preparing for it, they've really experienced these last few days much more than the rest of us. But I think they're doing well, and I think they've all had a real chance to bring some closure and some peace to their relationship with their father.
When you walked in the restaurant, so many people, the ladies at the table, grabbed you and hugged you. How does that help you?
Yeah, I mean, again, we share my grandfather with the world in many ways, but that love is mutual, right? Like, we feel that outpouring of support. It's wonderful for me to have people stop me on the street and say, I'm praying for you. To have people stop and say, I'm praying for your grandfather. And it's been happening, and just when we drove up from Plains in the funeral procession, the roads were lined with people. The overpasses on 75 were lined with people. And some of them had stopped their cars by the side of the road and were saluting. And others were holding signs and just waving. And it really is just a remarkable support for all of us and an uplifting for all of us that's really wonderful.
So in Washington, I know you'll be speaking. Can you share some of your remarks, or are you still working on them?
I'm still working on them. I mean, I've worked on them for a long time. And so we have, it's hard to try to sum him up in any sort of way. But especially in a small personal eulogy like we're going to deliver. So I'm still working on it, but I think really what you'll hear from me is what I think you saw from him, which is him living out his faith, living out his love for his family, but also for the world. And I think that's going to be the subject of the eulogy, because in my mind, that's the subject of his life.
Now, I know you can't tell me who else is speaking, because I know the Secret Service is involved with.
This is special coverage of ceremonies honoring the life of the 39th President of the United States, Jimmy Carter. I'm Lana Harris.
And I'm Rick Fulbaum. President Carter died last week at the age of 100. And up to now, events have really centered on locations here in Georgia, first in Plains, the president's hometown, and Atlanta, site of the Carter Center, where, of course, the public has had the chance over the last several days to go and pay their respects to the late president. And so we're going to now follow events that will eventually take him on to Washington.
Yeah, so this morning, President Carter's casket will leave the Carter Center for Dobbins Air Reserve Base in Marietta, where he'll be loaded onto a special presidential jet and flown to the nation's capital for tributes and memorial services there. On Thursday morning, there's going to be a state funeral at the National Cathedral in Washington.
And then after that service on Thursday, President Carter will be flown back here to Georgia for a service at his local church in Plains, Maranatha, followed by a private burial next to his late wife, Rosalind, on the grounds of the home that they built and lived in for so many years. And it is customary for U.S. presidents to be celebrated like this when they die. We're told that President Carter was very involved in planning for all of these events that we've seen and will see in the days to come.
And we want to start our coverage at the Carter Center, where the departure ceremony is happening.
Atlanta News First Sarah Hammond is there live. And Sarah, I know we can't see you. We're going to hear your voice off camera, but this should be an emotional moment given how important the Carter Center has been for President Carter since it was established after he left the White House.
It absolutely is, and I'm going to speak a little quietly because we're waiting on this ceremony to start. But, you know, this will be the last time that former President Jimmy Carter leaves what he often referred to as his home away from home in Atlanta. So we are in front of the circle of flags here at the Carter Center. We're waiting on the motorcade to arrive. You can see the hearse there in front of us. The honor guard is in place. We're now waiting on the Carter family to arrive, where a brief ceremony is supposed to start here in just about 5 minutes. Before President Carter leaves this area. Just to give you a little preview, we're going to hear from the 282nd Army Band. They're going to play Amazing Grace. We'll hear Hail to the Chief before the funeral procession, before the motorcade departs the Carter Center for the final time before they head off to board that jet to head to Washington, D.C. So we are just waiting for all of this to get underway in just about 3 minutes here, and then he is expected to leave the Carter Center at 11:30.
Talk to us. I know you've been out there, spent quite a bit of time since news crossed of the late president's death. Talk to us about what the scene has been like at the Carter Center and what it's been like over the last couple of days as people have been able to come and pay their respects.
Morning that between Saturday evening and this morning at 7 a.m. when that public viewing ended, that 23,000 people came through the Carter Center to, pay their final respects. And we've seen a lot of tears. We have heard a lot of stories from people who had met him or just knew of his legacy, and we've heard a lot of thank yous to former President Jimmy Carter, and a lot of people told us that walking through the Carter Center was a deeply moving experience for them, to be able to go through the museum first, to see the former president start as a peanut farmer in Plains, to his journey to become president of the United States, and then all of his humanitarian work that he did once he left office. And you then rounded the corner to see his casket draped in the American flag. So, this has been deeply emotional for quite a few people, and, a big time for people to be able to reminisce on their memories of him.
Of course, President Carter, the only U.S. president to have hailed from the state of Georgia. So while the nation is mourning his loss, it's being felt particularly hard here in Georgia. Of course, where he served as a state senator and governor before entering national politics and running for the White House. As we see there, some members of the honor guard who have been standing guard by the president, the late president's casket, over the last several days, as the public has had the chance to come in really around the clock.
Yeah, and it's been so touching to hear and see how people have honored the president. We had Madeline Montgomery, who was there when his hearse was loaded in to the motorcade and taken here to Atlanta, and she was saying that there were, it seemed like 200 people who were standing there, and it was quiet. She said you could essentially hear a pin drop, and you could really get the sense that people felt the gravity of what they were watching, history really unfolding right before their eyes.
That's right. So that ceremony is getting set, will begin any moment now. We want to give you a little bit of a preview of what you can expect throughout the day and into this afternoon and this evening. So at around 12:45 or so, the president's casket will be loaded onto a special presidential jet that's being dubbed Special Air Mission 39. Of course, President Carter was the 39th president of the United States. That should happen at around 12:45. And then at 2:15, that plane will land at Joint Andrews Base Joint Base Andrews, in Maryland, right outside of Washington, D.C., and that is where the next slate of ceremonies will take place.
Yeah, so and we have another full screen for you here. 3:30 p.m. is when that motorcade will arrive at the U.S. Navy Memorial. It is a nod, of course, to former President Jimmy Carter's time in the Navy. He was on submarines. And at 3:30, his remains will be transferred from the hearse to a horse-drawn caisson. 3:45 is when the funeral procession begins. It'll be a march up Pennsylvania Avenue to the U.S. Capitol. And at 4:10 p.m. is when they're expected to arrive at the U.S. Capitol.
And then Congress will pay its respects during the service at the Capitol Rotunda later tonight. 6 p.m. is when that will take place. And then President Carter will lie in state under the rotunda, and the public will have a chance to go and pay their respects to him there between tonight at around 7 o'clock or so until Thursday morning, when he will be moved to the National Cathedral in Washington, where a memorial service will be held. And dignitaries from around the country and around the world will be there to pay their respects to the former president. As we take a look now at some of the traffic impacts that are going to be felt today because of the motorcade, which is going to move from the Carter Center in Atlanta up to Marietta, where Dobbins is located, and the departure ceremony will take place. Let's check in with First Alert meteorologist Rodney Harris, can talk to us about some of the routes that people should be aware of here, some road closures that everybody should know about.
Yeah, so Rick and Lana, we are expecting this motorcade to start on the connector and go all the way up 75 to Dobbins. So right now, I have a live look at the connector. This is right around 10th and 14th Streets. The traffic that you see going from right to left, that is your northbound traffic. Right now we're fine, but we are expecting this part of the connector to shut down around 11:30 this morning, or just before 11:30. Again, just the northbound traffic. So here's what you can expect. Again, around 11:30, the connector northbound will close as that motorcade is passing through. Also want to point out, if you're in DeKalb County and you typically take 85 south, 85 will shut down right at 75 in Midtown Atlanta as that motorcade is moving along I-75 north. The closure will continue up 75 north in northwest Atlanta and all the way up into Cobb County. So just like 85, both directions of 285 will shut down at I-75 as that motorcade is passing by. That'll continue up I-75 north in Cobb County all the way up to Cobb Parkway before the motorcade exits to Dobbins Air Reserve Base. So these closures will happen prior to the motorcade, but as soon as the motorcade passes by, the interstates will open back up. But because it's right before lunch, we are expecting this to impact travel for you. Again, the connector still open right now, but Rick and Lana will let you know the moment that that shuts down.
Thanks so much for that, Rodney.
Okay, so the traffic you should know about, that's great. Let's go now to Marietta and Dobbins Air Reserve Base, and that's where we have Doug Reardon, who is standing by. And Doug, talk to us about what we can expect to see at Dobbins this morning.
Sure. Well, let me show you what we're seeing right now. You can see those planes, Rick, sitting on the runway, two of them, with those distinctive white and blue patterns and the American flag on the tail. One of those planes will be carrying Jimmy Carter and his family to Washington, D.C. in a matter of hours, if not even that, here. And you know, those have been sitting here since the very moment that we got out. And so they are ready here at Dobbins Air Force Base in Marietta. We're going to keep an eye on how this is all going as those planes sit there on the runway. But for now, we'll send it back to you in the studio.
All right, Doug, thanks very much. And you can see the blue and white plane. You know, you ordinarily associate that with Air Force One.
Right.
Of course, Air Force, there are several planes that have that very distinctive design to it. And whichever plane is carrying the living president is officially designated as Air Force One. So this will be a special jet that will take President Carter's body up to Washington, as we see the casket now being removed from the Carter Center for the last time. Flag-draped casket of the former president, who of course was a military veteran. We mentioned his time served in the Navy. He graduated from the Naval Academy. And so this is some of the pomp and circumstance that goes along with saying goodbye to a former head of state. And let's just watch and listen as we watch as the casket is brought out.
Well, you are watching history. This is the departure of President Jimmy Carter's casket, leaving the Carter Center for the last time as it makes its way to Dobbins Air Reserve Base in Marietta.
Atlanta News First Sarah Hammond is there at the Carter Center, as she has been in the last several days or so. A very touching ceremony, Sarah, and we see all the staff members from the Carter Center. We know that the library and museum staff has been invited to come out, volunteers, interns, graduate assistants, all of the people that have helped to carry on the work and the legacy of President Carter, able to witness this historic moment.
You're absolutely right. We're watching, former President Jimmy Carter pull out of here.
Sarah, we know you have to talk low, but could you just speak up a bit louder? Just a bit.
Yes, we are watching former President Jimmy Carter's first leave now the Carter Center for the final time here, as many who work at the Carter Center are standing by watching. We saw his casket be brought out of the Carter Center just a few moments ago, with his entire family coming behind him. As we heard from an Army band, they played Hail to the Chief and Amazing Grace in a moment, a very poignant moment here as he departs the Carter Center, his home away from home again in Atlanta for the final time, as they move on to D.C.
Yeah, we noticed a lot of people looking very somber, some even crying there. I think it's always interesting when someone passes and you end up learning so much about their life, so much more than you may have otherwise known. And these people would know and have an inside look at his life working there or interning there at the Carter Center. So they know exactly the kind of man that we just lost. It's funny that you mentioned Hail to the Chief. Former President Carter actually initially banned playing Hail to the Chief when he was the president, because he was a very humble man. He was pretty eager to downplay the grandeur of the office, but of course, over time, he relented, and he, of course, like other presidents, had a lot of say in what their funerals would look like. This has been in the makings for decades now. This has been planned. So, you know, it is a very somber day, certainly for a lot of the people there and a lot of Georgians watching across the state right now.
Right, and this is the beginning of what will be a full day of ceremonies and events honoring the former president. And at the end of this day, public will be able to go and pay their respects as he will lie in state underneath the rotunda at the U.S. Capitol building, just as he did here in Atlanta at the Carter Center. He is being given that honor and distinction, as other prominent Americans have after they have died, including presidents and Supreme Court justices and elected officials. President Carter will lie there, and eventually on Thursday there will be a state funeral for him held at the National Cathedral in Washington. But right now, again, just a look at the flag at half-staff, honoring the life and legacy of the 39th President of the United States, the only president to have hailed from the state of Georgia, President Carter, who of course made Atlanta really the home base for his post-presidential work. Plains, of course, his hometown where he lived, but he would come to Atlanta 1 week. He and his late wife Rosalind would come to Atlanta and to the Carter Center for 1 week out of every month, and they would sleep in a small apartment with a Murphy bed, a pull-down bed. And like you said, Lana, this was a president who sort of, you know, really wanted to did not want the trappings and all of the pageantry that is normally associated with the presidency. He wanted to be a common man, a man of the people, and it was that message and that persona that helped to elevate him to the White House in the first place. You remember, our country was coming out of a very difficult period of time in the mid-70s, having just lived through and watched the Vietnam War, which was such a divisive war for so many years. And then the presidency of Richard Nixon, which ended in his resignation in 1974, when a lot of Americans lost their trust in government. Of course, he was succeeded by his vice president, Gerald Ford, and that is the man who Jimmy Carter defeated in 1976 when he won the White House. But he won it on the promise of never telling the American people a lie. and staying true to his rural, humble roots. And this is really the location from which he launched a decade's worth of humanitarian work, peace missions, disease eradication, election monitoring, just to make sure that places around the country were having free and fair elections. So much done at this particular at the Carter Center, and that work will continue even after his death. The staff there will continue to carry forward with that important work as we continue to watch this flag. And we know that the motorcade that we just saw departing the Carter Center is now on its way up north, and we'll be traveling to the connector very soon.
So that may impact you as you head out the door this morning and throughout the afternoon. So Rodney Harris has been on top of this. Rodney, what can you tell people about how to get around this or what they need to know?
So you'll want to use north side, Lana and Rick. North side will eventually turn into Cobb Parkway. I'm actually looking at the connector right now live through our First Alert camera network. The connector is now closed north of Freedom Parkway. So Midtown Atlanta, the connector is now closed northbound. Southbound you can take, but northbound completely closed as this motorcade is about to travel through Midtown Atlanta. Again, Lana, Rick, your alternate route is to use north side, and as you know, north side will turn into Cobb Parkway, but they will have the connector shut down and I-75 North shut down all the way up to Cobb Parkway as this motorcade travels up to Dobbins Air Reserve Base. So that's happening as we speak, and we'll keep you up to date on the connector. And when that opens back up, I will say that once the motorcade passes the connector, it will open back up right away. But at this point, if you're in Midtown, just watch out for that. We'll continue to keep you up to date on this, Rick and Lana, in real time.
All right, and we see that live picture of the connector and those northbound lanes completely shut down, as we saw, as we take another live look at the Carter Center. And again, a place where so many Georgians have gone and visited. I know I have, and it's just a great opportunity for anyone who hasn't already to go and visit the Carter Center, to learn about the work that President Carter did in the years that he served in the White House from 1977 to 1981. It was only one term, and of course he was very disappointed to have lost his re-election bid to Ronald Reagan, but he did achieve quite a bit during those 4 years. A lot of people would say, however, that it was the decade that he spent as a former president that he made the most impact on the rest of the world, and all of the humanitarian work that included his being awarded the Nobel Peace Prize.
Yeah, it's definitely worth reading up or watching a documentary or watching something that kind of gives you more insight into former President Jimmy Carter's life, especially during this time. If you're at home and you're wondering, you know, what's the big deal? This really, really is a big deal. This was a giant of a man. He's often called, you know, a very humble boy from the South, grew up on a farm. That is all true. But this was a man who was very perseverant, very smart, attacked everything he went after. He was relentless in going after his goals, and he was relentless about helping people. And why not celebrate a man as best you can after 100 long, fruitful years on this planet, mostly in service to other people? I think one of the things that surprised me when I was learning about former President Jimmy Carter was, you know, when he was on the submarines, he was doing a lot of hard, difficult work, but he was still trying to learn one new thing a day, constantly reading, constantly learning something. Another thing really that touched me personally was knowing just how disappointed he was when he lost. This was a very public failure. America decided they did not want him to continue on with a second presidency, and this crushed him, and this crushed Rosalind Carter, his beloved wife. And for a lot of us, that might have been crippling. It might have had us go home and hang our heads and decide, you know what, the public has decided they don't want me. But he ended up saying, you know what, I'm going to do something else. I'm going to make this a second act, and I'm going to make this bigger and better than everything. And one could argue he's done that for decades. It turned into humanitarian projects across the world, 14 different countries, thousands of homes. He and his wife went to build or repair across the globe. That's why this is truly something that people around the globe right now are invested in, because he's genuinely been that person to go and try to make the world a better place in whatever way he could after that presidency. And I think, you know, his life is something that we could all take away from. No matter what happens, no matter how big it seems, how bad the failure may seem, there's always something next. And that's something I think that he leaves behind with me.
Very well said, Lana. You know, if you're just joining us here, coming up on 11:25 on this Tuesday morning, a very significant day as the nation mourns and remembers former President Jimmy Carter. If you weren't with us a few moments ago, we want to show you the video, the images of the president's casket being taken from the Carter Center and being placed into the hearse by the honor guard. You could hear the 282nd Army Band playing in the background. Hail to the Chief, ruffles and flourishes, and amazing grace. And let's just take another listen as we watch these images from just moments ago, very poignant images as Jimmy Carter leaves the Carter Center for the last time. Those were the scenes from just moments ago. As we take a live look here at the Carter Center, we've been told that the president's motorcade has just gotten on to I-75 North, heading towards Dobbins Air Reserve Base. And it is there where there will be a departure ceremony. And that will include Governor Brian Kemp and his wife, along with other local elected officials and leaders and friends of the Carter family who will be there for this departure ceremony. His remains will be loaded onto that plane right there, which, if it looks like Air Force One, that's because when there's a president on it, it is Air Force One. It is one of the presidential jets that President Biden sent specifically for the purpose of bringing President Carter's remains from Georgia up to Washington, D.C., where the remembrance ceremonies will continue until Thursday. And so we are expecting a ceremony where we will be able to watch the president's casket be loaded onto the plane. The Carter family, of course, will also be joining them for this trip up to Maryland to the air base there, and that is Andrews Air Force Base. And that is where he will be taken into the nation's capital for a number of different events that should be very, very moving over the course of the day. As we take a live look here, you can see those motorcycles in the lead, law enforcement in the lead of this procession that will take, again, the hearse and the family of the late president up to Dobbins Air Reserve Base in Marietta, where that blue and white plane, the presidential jet, is located and waiting for their arrival.
So this will impact the roads, of course, as you can see, as this motorcade makes its way down the interstate. So we want to bring Rodney Harris back in just to make sure everybody knows exactly what these impacts are going to be and how best to get around it.
Yes, Lana, Rick, and this is some very important information. The connector northbound is shut down. You can see that motorcade making its way north along the connector as we speak. What you'll want to do this morning, Rick and Lana, is if you're in Atlanta and you typically take the connector through Midtown Atlanta, your alternate route is to use Northside Drive, and as you know, Northside will eventually turn into Cobb Parkway. What they'll do here is take the connector north, and then from there, I-75 north up into Cobb County, and they'll get off at Cobb Parkway, eventually getting them to Dobbins Air Reserve Base. Also important to note that I-85 south, as you're coming out of DeKalb County, headed into Midtown Atlanta, they're going to shut that down. They already have right at the connector, and 285 in both directions at I-75 in Cobb County also closed again as that motorcade passes by. So this is happening as we speak. I will say, Rick and Lana, they're going to open this interstate back up as soon as the motorcade passes. So this will not be a long-term closure, but you're watching it live in real time. The connector north is shut down in Midtown Atlanta. So at this moment, you'll want to use North Side Drive turning into Cobb Parkway. And we'll keep you up to date, Rick and Lana, in real time as this motorcade continues to travel and impact your roads.
And we can see some motorists there on the overpasses there. And I don't know whether that's the 17th Street exit, but one of the exits that goes across the connector, motorists stopping, slowing down to look below to the highway and see and watch, that is 17th Street, I'm told, to watch this motorcade as it passes by. And again, this motorcade contains the hearse that is carrying the late president, along with vehicles carrying the late president's family, all of whom will be joining him on a trip to Washington, D.C. today, which will include more ceremonies, more pomp and circumstance, along with a service underneath the Capitol Rotunda. Elected officials, leaders in Washington will be eulogizing him, including Vice President Kamala Harris. She'll be one of the speakers at the ceremony that's set to take place later on today. And then the public will be invited to come and pay their respects, as President Carter will lie in state under the rotunda until Thursday morning ahead of his state funeral, which will be held at the National Cathedral, also, of course, in Washington, D.C. And that, too, will be very well attended. The funeral service will have all of the living former presidents and first ladies, along with presidential candidates and elected officials and leaders from around the world, Lana, because this is a president who was very well traveled, of course, during his presidency, but even more so after he left office, with all of the traveling that he did around the world in his humanitarian work. And we're told that the connector, this is just an aside, the connector has already reopened down back behind the motorcade as it has already passed through.
Right. I think one of the things that he was most proud of in his presidency was the Camp David Accords. I mean, that was something that a lot of people did not think was possible. And he got together the Israeli leader and the leader of Egypt. And, you know, after a few days that started off with the leaders not able to talk to each other, barely be in the same room, they hugged at the end, and there was an agreement made. So this was the type of work that he did as president that has a lasting impact. And you see all this pomp and circumstance here, and we've told you that this is not really his thing. We have told you that this is something that he was involved in heavily, as all presidents are deeply involved in the planning of their funerals. This is something that he wanted to do. He gave in a bit to the demands and the tradition and agreed to a sort of elaborate memorial service, as is well deserved. The only thing that he drew the line at originally in the plans was that he refused to let his remains be transported back to Georgia for burial by train. So he is going to be flown. And I think one thing that we saw over the weekend was so many people who lined the streets. Right now, you know, people are back at work. It'd be quite dangerous for people to be there on your screen where we're watching the motorcade live right now. But throughout that motorcade's route from Americus to Plains, the former president's hometown, up here to Atlanta, people lined the streets just to watch it go by and say goodbye and really think about that. And I mean on the side of the road where the interstate entrance is. People had found out that the president's motorcade was going to be passing by, and they stood out there for 40 minutes. Wouldn't you say, Rick?
Mm-hmm.
We saw them in our live shots around the area. They just stood there waiting just to watch. This is a historic moment that we're seeing as we take another live look at the Air Reserve Base here. And it's just a very momentous day. If you have kids, you might want to have them come and watch and just make sure they know the legacy that former President Jimmy Carter leaves behind.
And we watch these pictures. We want to just remind you of what is coming. There will be a departure ceremony at Dobbins, and you can see some of the personnel who will be involved, the military personnel, of course, in uniform, who will be involved in that ceremony. That will also be attended by the Carter Center counselors, friends and family of the Carters, along with Governor Kemp and other local elected officials who have all been invited to help see the president off as he heads to Washington one last time. A town that really was never quite welcomed him during his presidency. Washington is a very insular place, and here was this rural governor from the South, from Georgia, who made it very clear and plain that he was going to shake things up. And so he was not exactly welcomed with open arms during his time in Washington, but he will return there for the customary ceremonies that we always use to honor and remember presidents and other notable Americans after they have died. And so this is a ceremony that will take place, and we're going to have live coverage of it for you as we watch on the left, the motorcade carrying the president to Dobbins, on the right, the special plane that will carry the president's body to Washington, D.C. We have Doug Reardon at Dobbins Air Base, and we'll talk with him in a moment. But just so you know what to expect, there will be ceremonial troops presenting arms and rendering honors. We'll be able to hear some more music, ruffles and flourishes, hail to the chief. There will also be a 21-gun salute that will take place in honor of the president. And then immediately after that, the U.S. Army's Maneuver Center of Excellence Band will begin playing Nearer My God to Thee. And then the body-bearing team will carry the late president's remains through the honor cordon to the aircraft loader, and we will be able to watch as that ceremony plays out. Again, that is all coming up very soon. As once that motorcade arrives at Dobbins, that ceremony will begin. And we'll have the live coverage for you right here on Atlanta News First.
And you were mentioning his presidency, and I don't know if you realize how fascinating his run for presidency was, but he was virtually, I don't even think the word virtually is necessary. He really was not known across the country. He was known very well in Plains. By that point, he was known very well in Georgia, where he'd been the governor here and a state senator here. But across the country, when he was running for president, nobody really knew what he was. And he got almost his whole family to just go across the country and campaign for him. And like Rick was saying earlier, he was doing it on a promise of never telling a lie and just trying to lead with integrity at a time America really needed it. So if you can think about what an effort that must have been to go from state to state and bit by bit, just introduce yourself to people in general in that state and get them to vote for you when they've never heard of you before. So this was a monumental task, and it was quite a feat that he was actually able to accomplish this. And again, at a time where America really just needed a breath of fresh air, they found it in this Georgia boy who was grown right here down in Plains and grew up on that farm. He grew up in a time where segregation was a really big deal, of course, as we know in this country around that time. He grew up with black friends, and that really stayed with him throughout his life. It impacted how he treated black people at a time where our country wasn't always so kind. So this really plays into who the man we know and saw. For better or worse, he did try his absolute best to do with the presidency what he could with the power that he had. And I think that's something that, could sit with you as we watch live as he heads to the Air Force Base here, the Air Reserve Base, I should say, here in Georgia.
I think that's why, Lana, there's been such an outpouring of emotion and respect towards the former president. Some 23,000 people over the last couple of days making their way to the Carter Center to pay their respects as he was lying in repose there. And so, there really was a connection between the people of Georgia and the only president that Georgia ever sent to the White House, the only person ever elected from the state of Georgia to be the commander-in-chief. A real connection that really continues to this day, and that really transcended politics in this era of partisanship where we have so much political division, people on one side of the aisle, people on the other side of the aisle. President Carter, of course, was a Democrat, but in his post-presidency years, he was really sort of just thought of as a statesman, no longer associated with any kind of political ideology, although obviously he did have very strong political views. But in this time when we are honoring him and remembering him, you're hearing tributes coming from people of all political stripes, from, of course, President Biden to President-elect Donald Trump, both of whom issued statements upon news of his death, honoring him and calling on the country to honor his legacy and honor his memory. And so it is a sort of a refreshing change to what we've grown accustomed to here again with the hyper-partisanship, to see this kind of bipartisan, universal outpouring of affection and respect for former President Carter is a nice change of pace as we honor his 100 years on this earth. And again, if you're just joining us here, we are watching the motorcade that is taking the president's body to Dobbins Air Reserve Base in Marietta, where he will board the blue and white plane. Again, famously, Air Force One, when it's carrying a living president, that is when it has the distinction of being Air Force One. But for all intents and purposes, it is a presidential jet that President Biden sent specifically for the purpose of bringing President Carter and his family to Washington for the events that will take place there over the next couple of days between this afternoon and Thursday. And we'll have a whole slate of events taking place there, culminating in a memorial service that will be held at the National Cathedral on Thursday morning before he is then returned back to Georgia for burial in Plains. So all of these events, really history in the making. We don't get to say goodbye to former presidents on a regular basis. George H.W. Bush, the last U.S. president, former U.S. president to have died, and he received very similar honors and tributes upon his passing. And now we see this obviously playing out for Georgia's own Jimmy Carter.
Now we can see this motorcade here live, traveling through a pretty busy area of our town. So we want to get back to Rodney Harris, who's been on top of this. We know that there's been some openings of the roads that were initially closed, Rodney.
There have, Lana. So the connector is now open in Midtown Atlanta. It opened very quickly. So if you're in Midtown, the connector now completely open. We actually have a camera right now on I-75 North near Truist Park. And on that camera, you will see that I-75 is closed in Cobb County and Smyrna and up into South Marietta up to Delk Road. Again, I-75 North is closed in Cobb County all the way up to Delk Road. A live camera that I'm looking at that's showing you that. So if you're in Cobb County right now, you are being impacted by this motorcade. In addition to I-75, 285 in both directions also closed at I-75. So that's your current travel impact. Rick and Lana, I was giving alternate routes earlier, but you don't really need an alternate route because they are opening the interstate so quickly after the motorcade passes that these are very short-term closures. So if you're actually listening to me right now and you do have to get onto I-75, by the time you get there, I-75 and Cobb will be back open. But again, at this point, you can actually see with Chopper, that is 75 that we're looking at directly next to Truist Park. So it's closed, but it's about to open back up. So as the motorcade continues toward Delk Road, if you are in Cobb County, within like the next 2 or 3 minutes, all of I-75 will basically be back open.
All right, Rodney, thanks very much. As we continue to watch the motorcade heading towards Dobbins Air Reserve Base, they're not too far away from there now. So we'll continue to keep an eye on that. And there, of course, is the airplane that will transport the former president and his family to Washington, D.C. This aircraft is being dubbed Special Air Mission 39 in honor of President Carter, who was, of course, the 39th president of the United States. We are in a period of national mourning. 30 days declared by President Biden after news crossed that President Carter had passed away, and there will be a national day of mourning on Thursday, the day of President Carter's memorial service and funeral, a state funeral that will be held at the National Cathedral in Washington. And again, these are all events, and the choreography of this has all been well planned out, well ahead of time. And it's something that President Carter actually had a say in. He was allowed to sort of weigh in and say yes to certain things and no to certain things. Lana, you mentioned he didn't want his body transported on train. That was a tradition long ago. When presidents would die, their bodies would be transported by rail on a train car, where it would stop at various places so that the public could come out and pay their respects. Jimmy Carter saying, nope, don't want that. I'd like to fly to Washington and then fly back to Georgia. And so that is what we are going to see happen today and on Thursday.
So we have Atlanta News first Doug Reardon there at Dobbins. Doug, can you give us a sense of what it's like to be there right now?
Sure. Well, we know the motorcade, guys, is getting close because traffic is starting to back up here a little bit down the road from the entrance where we are. But let's see what we can still show you. That base entrance is just about a quarter mile up the road from where we are. But we wanted to be here so that we could show you this plane and that we could be here when it was taking off. And I know we have a much closer shot if we could get to that. But what we did want to tell you was we've been running into people out here all morning, folks who either took off work. One lady told me she was supposed to be at work, but she just wanted to come out here and watch this plane take off as kind of a final show of respect to Jimmy Carter, someone who a lot of people around here admired. Even that one woman we talked to who said she didn't vote for him, but really respected what she did in his post-presidency with all of his humanitarian work and all of his work at the Carter Center as well. So people out here have a deep, profound respect, just as we find inside the perimeter. A lot of people that we spoke to out here this morning weren't able to get to the Carter Center actually to say their final goodbyes to the former president, and so they thought coming out here, watching him take off for kind of the final round of these ceremonies for his life would be the best way to commemorate his life and legacy as a Georgian. And so, Rick, you mentioned that day of mourning. I just want to note a couple of different things. During that day of mourning, which will be Thursday, that's the same day that the state funeral in D.C. as well as the burial back in Plains, Georgia will take place. Government agencies, many of them, including the post office, are going to be shut down. So people should, if they have any need to use those services, plan around that. Administrative buildings at national parks are going to be shut down. All executive agencies associated with the government are going to be shut down as well. And we know that once he gets to D.C. later on today, there is going to be a lot going on. He's going to be lying in state ahead of that state funeral on Thursday, where President Joe Biden will give the eulogy, as well as the son of the man who preceded Jimmy Carter, Stephen Ford, Gerald Ford's son, will be reading a eulogy that was written by Gerald Ford in 2006. So you're going to get some words from the past when you listen in on Thursday. And again, the atmosphere out here, we are outside of the base, but we have been watching this really steady flow of people coming, pulling off on the side of the road. If you see them there taking some pictures as we believe the motorcade is just arriving. We see that chopper overhead, and so traffic is stopped. This is just kind of another one of those moments, and we've seen so many of them over the last couple of days for people to pause, reflect, and take it all in. Guys, back to you.
Talk to us about the impact, Doug, because I know that you have studied this and reported on it over the last months. The impact that Jimmy Carter had. We watched him leave the Carter Center in Atlanta, but the impact overall that he had on the state of Georgia.
Well, the impact is huge. Just take yesterday, the story that we did, and the conservation efforts that a lot of people don't know about. Him protecting the Chattahoochee River and establishing the recreational area there. Him doing the same for the Flint River and the Chattooga River. He actually started the state's Department of Film, which is now a bustling industry in the state of Georgia. And then when you look at his impact on Georgia from the federal office that he held, he started the Department of Energy. He started what we now know as the Department of Education. And so he had his handprints on all sorts of things that are still really impactful today in your everyday lives. If you send a kid to school, if you flip on a light switch in your house, these are all things that Jimmy Carter had a hand in. And so it's actually kind of hard to understate. And I know people really focus on some of the bigger things in his presidency, the hostage crisis, the inflation, but when you really take a granular look at what Jimmy Carter did as a politician, not just for the people of Georgia, but for the entire United States, it's actually hard to understate just how much he did. And so, yeah, I think that's why people resonate so much with him, on top of the fact that he did it all with a smile on his face. He did it all facing these really massive consequential things like inflation, like the hostage crisis, and he did it with that kind of regular guy attitude. And so, that really is, in my opinion, why you're seeing this huge response to the death of this great man.
I think one thing that we also saw that was truly, truly extraordinary was the images of him in his later years still working on homes with Habitat for Humanity. There was a point where he had even taken a fall and he had a bruise under his eye, and he was still out there in some of the last years of his life, so in his older age, still out there doing the heavy work. We heard one story where there was one Habitat for Humanity site that there were going to be a few lawmakers invited to, and it seemed as if maybe some of these lawmakers may have thought they were there for a photo op, and the former president handed them some tools and said, no, we're here to get some work. We're doing work here. So this was somebody who was really put his money where his mouth was. You know, he really had a heart to help people. And then we saw from the people who got to move into some of these homes, and they were so grateful. And they had a home that was literally built by a former president. This is the kind of man who we are honoring today.
That's right. And when a lot of other former presidents leave office, they go on to very lucrative careers on the public lecture circuit, collecting hundreds of thousands of dollars in speaking fees for going around and making speeches to various corporations and other events. President Carter decided that was not going to be his path. He chose something different, and really the way that he continued to earn an income after leaving the office of the presidency, the president, was to write books. Right. And he was a prolific author, writing over 30 books during his lifetime on all sorts of topics, writing also about death in a number of books that he wrote. And he was a man of faith. We've talked about that a great deal. He taught Sunday school for many, many years at Maranatha Baptist Church in Plains. Faith sort of a through line for President Carter from his childhood straight through to the end of his life. And so this was a man who believed in an afterlife. He believed in the opportunity to be reunited with loved ones in death. He had talked about that. He had written about that. And so as we watch all of these events unfold, it's something I think to keep in mind for those who are looking for comfort. Maybe we can find it in knowing that he is in a better place and he is where he wanted to be with the people he wanted to be with.
And of course, now with Rosalind Carter, his beloved wife of 77 years. The two did everything together. They were partners in every sense of the word. She was right there with him every step of the way. And, you know, their relationship was truly one that was so sweet to watch, to see. The two of them did volunteer projects together. She was there in the White House with them. She was kind of a soundboard for him as he was working through things. They would listen to different proposals together, either in the White House or in other projects throughout their lives, and they would go back and they would talk about them together. When he was a state senator, they went up here to Atlanta and back to Plains together. Governor, back to Plains together. Presidency, back to Plains together. They really spent their whole lives as partners and always going back to Plains, Georgia. So when we call him just a humble president, this was someone who traveled the world and somehow still ended up back here in Plains, Georgia, where it was just he was homegrown. That's where he was from. And the people of Plains, if anybody from Plains, Georgia is watching right now, they had his back throughout his entire career. I was watching something the other day, and it was talking about how when he lost the presidency, there were crowds of people there in Plains just to welcome him home and be a support system for him. So as we take a live look here at Dobbins Air Reserve Base, where it seems a motorcade may be pulling up pretty soon, we could see it in a different shot that we just showed you there on screen. A lot of people here honoring this wonderful man.
Doug Reardon is at Dobbins for us. He's outside of the perimeter of this area. But Doug, talk to us about this event that we're about to witness, this departure ceremony, as the president's casket is loaded onto this plane, which has been dubbed Special Air Mission 39 in honor of the 39th president.
Yeah, Rick, so as you can see there, those planes, one of them is going to turn into Air Force One, because as you've been mentioning all day, when the president is on there, it becomes Air Force One. And so what's going to happen is the casket is going to be taken out of the limousine, the hearse where it was inside when it was in that motorcade. Governor Brian Kemp is going to be there with his wife Marty on the runway. They are going to see it up into Air Force One, and then it's going to take off. I'm trying to figure out the orientation of the runway and which way it might be coming, whether it's going to be coming towards us or away. But once that plane is in the air, it won't touch down again until it is in Washington, D.C. And from there, Carter will be kind of in reverse of this process, taken off the plane, loaded onto another hearse, and then taken by a couple of significant places. They're going to drive him down Pennsylvania Avenue, which is where the U.S. Naval Memorial is. Of course, he served many, many years in the U.S. Navy as a nuclear submarine captain. He was really quite involved. That's not an easy job to do, and so they're taking him by the U.S. Naval Memorial before he's put into a horse-drawn carriage and brought up Pennsylvania Avenue to kind of round out that route to the Capitol Rotunda, where he'll be lying in state today ahead of his state funeral on Thursday. And so, you know, this is kind of one of those things where there is a lot of anticipation. We know exactly what to expect because it is so similar with each president that passes. We haven't had one in a number of years here since George H.W. Bush passed away. But we know how this goes, and so it's going to look very similar. If everyone remembers that back in, I believe, 2016, it's going to look very similar to that process. And of course, Jimmy Carter's Secret Service members will be with him. They will be also with him when he gets back to Plains, those men who protected him for his entire life and continued to do so even after he left the presidency and moved back to Plains. And so we, of course, when that happens, when he is pulling up onto the runway and they take him out of the hearse, we're going to see again, and we'll talk you through it at that point.
We are seeing some live pictures right now of Governor Kemp and his wife Marty arriving. Also, the mayor of Atlanta, Andre Dickens, is there, and other elected officials who have been invited. We're told that about 195 guests were expected at this ceremony that we're about to watch, including the Carter Center Board of Counselors, a group of Atlanta business leaders who meet quarterly to talk about and learn about the work being done at the Carter Center. There will be other divisions from the military there, including leaders from the 94th Airlift Wing, the Georgia National Guard, the 22nd Air Force, and the Navy Reserve Center, Atlanta, all there for this ceremony, which will include 4 ruffles and flourishes and Hail to the Chief. We'll be hearing those. And then as the remains are being loaded onto the aircraft, we will hear Near My God to Thee, a hymn, of course, very meaningful to President Carter and something that no doubt he requested because as we've been saying, he had a lot of say in these events that we have been watching unfold over the last days since his death was announced. And then we're going to witness a 21-gun salute, fitting for a former commander-in-chief. And so that is why all of those people have gathered, and they are waiting for this event, this ceremony to begin, just as we are, coming to pay their respects to really the most prominent person to ever come from the state of Georgia, Jimmy Carter, who rose again from the peanut farm of Plains to the presidency. And again, we are watching this event and this departure ceremony, Lana, which is about to get underway once the hearse and the rest of the motorcade arrives.
And you can see, as we are looking at a crowd full of people who have been, of course, pre-selected, as Rick was just saying, to be there to watch this historic moment. This transcends politics, it transcends parties, and you know, in a time that has been just so polarizing for our country, it is nice to have a moment where we can just say, hey, this is a man that deserves our time, our respect, our honors, and let's come together and let's see him off in the way that he deserves. And so we have team coverage, of course, today. We have been following this, of course, throughout the weekend. This started back in Americus, Georgia, at Phoebe Sumter, where his hearse was loaded in and taken on that motorcade, I should say, from Americus to Plains, where there were crowds full of people, the people in his hometown there who came just to pause and watch his motorcade pass by and pay respects. It traveled up here to Atlanta, to the Carter Center, where it has been he's been lying there in repose, and we have seen people come around the clock, just stop by and pause. I mean, it was powerful. And you'll see some of those same images when he gets to the state capitol in Washington, D.C., where he's going to lie in repose throughout today and Wednesday, and you'll just see what he means to people, to his fellow Americans, people he tried to do so much for, and I would say successfully did. So this is, again, a live look at Dobbins Air Reserve Base, where that motorcade should be touching down any moment now. We had to shut down the highways, of course, for it to come from the Carter Center down here to Dobbins Air Reserve Base. And we have Doug Reardon out there live right now, and he said that traffic is picking up in that area as well. So it seems like they are getting a bit closer now. But this is all planned out. This has been planned for decades. It takes a long time to plan for a presidential funeral. The presidents, again, like we've been saying, have a lot of sway. They have a lot of input in what they want and what they don't want. And so that's where we are now. And we will let you know the moment we can see. We're watching this alongside with you. It's a live look there at Dobbins Air Reserve Base. And if you are just joining us right now, this is Atlanta News First at noon. And we have been watching the funeral services proceed for former President Jimmy Carter.
And this is an event that will be, that's being called a departure ceremony. Governor Kemp is there, Mayor Dickens is there, as are other elected leaders and business leaders from Atlanta, from the state of Georgia, all invited to witness this historic moment as we watch former President Jimmy Carter's casket being loaded onto a special presidential aircraft that is being dubbed Special Air Mission 39. In honor of the 39th President of the United States. And you see Governor Kemp there in a center screen with his sunglasses, his wife Marty by his side, and all of the other people. You see Mayor Dickens there on the right, all of the other invited guests who are there to witness this event that will take place once the hearse and the rest of the motorcade arrives. There will be a number of different songs that we'll hear, music that we will hear that will be played, along with a 21-gun salute, and then the plane will take off for Washington. And we've been talking about some of the events that are going to take place later on today. There will be a ceremony at the U.S. Capitol as the remains of the late president are brought there to lie in state until Thursday. And that ceremony this afternoon will feature eulogies and remarks from Vice President Kamala Harris, Speaker of the House Mike Johnson, and the new Senate Majority Leader John Thune, who recently took on that position. So a Democrat and two Republicans who will be eulogizing President Carter today. Again, just another example of the bipartisanship or the nonpartisanship that surrounds the death of Jimmy Carter, who really meant so much to so many people, both during his time in office here in Georgia as a state senator, as a governor, and then as president of the United States for 4 years before entering his post-presidency, which a lot of people will say really makes up the bulk of his legacy, the work that he carried out, that his wife Rosalind and he carried out, the humanitarian work that they did through the Carter Center in terms of eradicating disease, saving the lives of millions of people in Africa who were dying from guinea worm disease. It was determined that if only these people were given clean drinking water, clean water to bathe in, that they would be able to avoid coming down with this deadly disease. And so President Carter was instrumental in seeing to it that that clean drinking water was delivered. And so millions of lives spared as a result of that work. Of course, he was also involved with monitoring elections around the world, including here in the United States. And again, continuing to work on behalf of the American people, on behalf of the American government, sometimes being sent as a special envoy to talk with world leaders. So that is work that he continued. It led to him being awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, an award that he was very, very proud of, sort of in recognition of his of his work as a humanitarian, as a peacemaker. And so it is really with that legacy that we watch the country coming together to say goodbye and to pay their last respects to a former U.S. president. We haven't had that many of them over the course of our country's history. Once President-elect Trump is sworn in January 20th, he will be the 47th president of the United States, holding the distinction of actually being the 45th and the 47th president of the United States. But again, not very many presidents over the course of our country's history. And so it is a significant moment when one of them dies, as we are marking this occasion here with President Jimmy Carter, who was the only U.S. president in the history of our country to have hailed from Georgia.
Now, to give you a bit of a rundown of what's going to happen next, here at Dobbins Air Reserve Base in Marietta, he's going to be loaded onto the jet that you see, the special presidential jet. He'll be flown to the nation's capital for tributes and memorial services there. And on Thursday morning, there's going to be a state funeral at the National Cathedral in Washington. And then after that service on Thursday, President Carter is going to be flown back to Georgia for a service at his local church in Plains. And then there's going to be a private burial next to his late wife, Rosalind, of course, right there on the grounds of the home that they built and they lived in and went back to for so many years. As we've been saying, it is customary for U.S. presidents to be celebrated like this when they pass. President Carter has been there for every moment of the planning for this. So this was something that he wanted to see, all of it, and approved. And to give you kind of a time rundown of what will be happening here, around 12:45 is when that Special Air Mission 39 departs to go to Washington, D.C. And then it's expected to get there around 2:15. It'll arrive at Joint Base Andrews in Maryland. And at that point, 2:45, the Motorcade will depart for the U.S. Navy Memorial. Of course, the former president was in the Navy. He worked on submarines. So this was going to be just a very touching moment for them to be able to say goodbye. 3:30 p.m. is when that Motorcade will arrive at the U.S. Navy Memorial, and his remains will be transferred from hearse, I should say, to horse-drawn caisson. And then at 3:45, 15 minutes later, is when the funeral procession begins that march up Pennsylvania Avenue to the U.S. Capitol. At 4:10, he will arrive at the U.S. Capitol. And about 20 minutes later, Congress will pay respect during a service right there in the rotunda where he will lie in state. And at 6 p.m. is when we will see the public able to go and lie in state, just like he lied here at the Carter Center. And he chose to lie in state, to lie in repose at the Carter Center instead of at the state capitol here. And you can imagine why. The Carter Center is where he spent a lot of his life. It's where he did some of the best work of his life, some of the most meaningful work of his life. And so for him, instead of having people go to the state capitol, which, you know, played a role in his life, but perhaps not as big, he felt it was a better reflection of him and his life and what he was leaving behind to have people come see him and say goodbye to him there.
I can't help but think of the Carter family. Of course, most of us have experienced a death in the family before. It's usually something that is grieved and mourned in private or with very, very close circle of family and friends. But in this case, the Carter family is having to mourn their loss with the nation. And so a very different type of experience for the former president's children and grandchildren and nieces and nephews, a very large extended Carter family who has been there for these events beginning in Americus. As you were going through the events of the last couple of days, Lana, we've seen the Carter family accompany Mr. Carter's remains from Americus, then to Plains. And you mentioned the different stops along the way, you know, the motorcade slowing down. We saw that on Saturday where the motorcade left the Phoebe Sumter Medical Center, and then on its way through Plains, it stopped, it paused very briefly at President Carter's boyhood farm, where there was a ceremonial ringing of the bell, a bell that held great significance on the grounds of the farm, a bell that really woke up the Carter children. President Carter, when he was a boy, that bell signaled the start of the workday on the farm, and that bell was rung 39 times on Saturday in honor of the 39th president. And then his casket was brought to Atlanta, stopping at a number of different places in South Georgia along the way. Again, just to pay tribute to some of the significant milestones and places along the former president's life. And we'll see that again later this afternoon when the plane lands in Washington and pauses briefly at the U.S. Navy Memorial. And now you can see the hearse there pulling on to the grounds at the Dobbins Air Reserve, where that casket will be brought right up to that airplane that has been dubbed Special Air Mission 39 for today's events. Out of respect for these events, we're going to keep our talking to a minimum so that we can hear and see all of these events play out, these historic events. We are expecting to see the ceremonial troops presenting arms and rendering honors. There will be musical selections. These are, of course, associated with any commander-in-chief for ruffles and flourishes and hail to the chief. We are also expecting to hear a 21-gun salute, which is, of course, fitting for a former commander-in-chief. Then immediately after that, as the president's remains are placed on the aircraft, we'll be hearing the U.S. Army's Maneuver Center of Excellence Band playing Nearer My God to Thee, a hymn that was very special to the late president. You see those 4 chairs that have been set up. Not sure exactly who's going to be sitting in them. But again, we're going to watch all of this play out and keep our talking to a minimum out of respect for the events that are unfolding live right now at Dobbins Air Reserve Base, Marietta, Georgia. Body bearers get set to remove the president's casket from the hearse. And we have been watching the departure ceremony for former President Jimmy Carter, who died last week at the age of 100. His casket loaded on to Special Air Mission 39, about to depart from Dobbins Air Base on its way to Washington, D.C. Our coverage will end here on Atlanta News First in just a moment, but we're going to continue on Peachtree TV and ANF Plus, which you can find streaming on Roku, Fire TV, Apple TV, and YouTube. Stay with us. And this has been special coverage of the departure ceremony for the late President Jimmy Carter, who died at the age of 100 after days of remembrances here in Georgia. Former president will now head to Washington, D.C. for another series of events and ceremonies, including a state funeral, which will be held on Thursday morning at the National Cathedral in Washington. But we have just watched a very touching and moving military service where the president's remains were loaded onto that airplane called Special Air Mission 39, a presidential jet. Looks a lot like Air Force One. And this is the plane that will carry the former president and his family to Washington. Again, a departure ceremony attended by Governor Kemp and Mayor Dickens of Atlanta, along with other Georgia elected officials and leaders, family and friends of the Carter family who have come out to pay their respects and really to watch history as we continue the process of saying goodbye to a former president of the United States. It's not something that happens all the time, of course. It hasn't happened since the death of former President George H.W. Bush. But these are customary events surrounding the death of a former head of state. And so we watch all of this play out, knowing that this is the only time that this has happened with a president who hailed from the state of Georgia. And so we are watching these events, and we will watch until this aircraft takes off, Lana, on its way to Washington.
Yeah, it was so touching. This was a historical moment. I hope that you were able to watch it in its entirety. Of course, we were watching live along with you, and we will have this on our website and, of course, our Atlanta News First app in case you missed any of it. You are watching this right now on Atlanta News First and Peachtree TV. Our coverage will continue on Peachtree TV, and, of course, if you have to leave the TV, you can always continue watching on our streaming app, Atlanta News First Plus, which you can find on Roku and Apple TV.
And we're glad you're with us here on Peachtree TV as we continue to watch the departure of former President Jimmy Carter, who has now had his remains, his casket has been loaded onto that plane. His body will now be flown to Washington, D.C. for events that will take place there over the next couple of days before he is brought back home to Georgia for a ceremony at his private church here in Plains, Georgia, followed by a private ceremony, a private burial on the grounds of the home that he and his late wife Rosalind built and lived in for so many years. All of those events taking place on Thursday. This is a period of national mourning as we say goodbye to a former commander-in-chief, the only one to have hailed from the state of Georgia.
So we want to get out to Atlanta News First Doug Reardon, who is there at Dobbins right now. You were there live watching this really momentous occasion. It was so somber. Doug, how was this for you?
Yeah, you know, we have kind of an interesting vantage, Rick and Lana, because we are kind of at the end of the runway where this is going to end up happening on the other side of the fence outside of Dobbins here. And we've been able to talk to people all morning who have stopped on the side of the road. There are cars piled up here in the breakdown lane for people who just wanted to come and watch this happen. A lot of similarities between the folks that we've talked to, saying that they had this great respect for Jimmy Carter, not only as a Georgian, but also as a humanitarian, as someone who took his post-presidency and kind of licked his wounds and went back and did so much for so many various communities. I remember when he first entered into hospice about 2 years ago, we interviewed someone who had written 2 biographies on Jimmy Carter, and he said, and this always stuck with me, that he was the president who did more outside of the White House than he did when he was serving in it. And so that's what people are out here to kind of honor at Dobbins today. And you know, a lot of these folks couldn't make it to the Carter Center to go and see him laying in repose there. And so this was, they said, the best they could do. We, in fact, just talked to a gentleman who said, you know, I waited outside for a long time and it was just too cold. I had to come. And so I had to come back from the Carter Center without seeing him. And so he said, this was kind of my way to say goodbye to him. I came out here to watch this plane take off, to watch him take this final leg of his journey as he goes to D.C. And as I said earlier, you know, we love him here in Georgia. He means so much to us as our only president from Georgia, but we have to share him with the rest of the country and the rest of the world. And so this will be a chance for other people to go and pay their respects in person over the next couple of days as he lies in state in the U.S. Capitol Rotunda. But this is just another one of those examples where you can gauge the measure of the man by the response to something he has done. In this case, you know, passing away after 100 years. We've seen people out here all morning, and we've been out here for a long time, since about 9:30 in the morning. And even then, there were people when we pulled over on the side of the road that had already staked out their spot, had their cameras out. We're getting some videos of Air Force One and the additional U.S. aircraft here that's going to be accompanying Jimmy Carter and his family into Washington, D.C. And it just says a lot. And so just to kind of recap what we saw a little earlier, there was, of course, the more traditional things that are associated with commanders-in-chief, whether it be a ceremony while they are alive or after their passing, 4 ruffles and flourishes, Hail to the Chief being played before that 21-gun salute by those really hefty cannons. We could see the smoke rising as we watched that live stream from where we are right here at the end of the runway, and we could hear the echoes from the cannons indicating that that was happening to us. And then that hymn, Nearer My God to Thee. When Carter lands in Washington, D.C., they're going to do just about every single one of those same steps, the same processional steps. They're going to play those songs, and then they're going to finish with another hymn, another one of his favorites, as he's brought off the plane by those body bearers. When you look at the order of how this is going, in terms of people, where they're actually standing in this processional line, you're going to first see, as we did when he was going onto the plane, same as when he's coming off, the national colors, so the United States flag, followed by members of clergy, a lot of people who Jimmy Carter was close to in his life. He was a very godly person, put a lot of stock into making sure that that was something that was always important to him, followed by the body bearers and the casket, and then finally the presidential colors, that seal with the eagle clutching the scroll and the arrow that we associate with the President of the United States. And so that will be the same processional order coming off the plane in D.C. as it was getting onto the plane here at Dobbins. It's Special Air Mission 39 that will be carrying Jimmy Carter's body and his family to Washington, D.C. Of course, Carter, the 39th President of the United States. And so I know Rick said it a couple times this morning, you know, whenever there is a commander-in-chief on board one of the planes that we're looking at right now, it becomes Air Force One. And so that is the case today. It's Air Force One in in practice, but it is Special Mission 39, as Carter was the 39th president. They're going to arrive later this afternoon at Joint Base Andrews, Maryland. That is a very short drive from downtown Washington, D.C., where Carter will disembark the plane with his body bearers. They will put him inside a hearse there on the tarmac, and they will take him first to the United States Naval Memorial. Carter spent many years aboard nuclear submarines as a member of the U.S. Navy. It was actually one of those little anecdotes that you pick up covering this along the way. Rosalind actually wanted Jimmy Carter to stay in the U.S. Navy. It was really an important part of both of their lives. And Rosalind, Jimmy Carter joked in years past that she was looking forward to being the officer's wife, that she liked the comfortable life that came with being an officer in the United States Navy. And that's Carter, having attended the academy, that's what he was. And so that was kind of their plan. That was, if you will, their 10-year plan, was to ride out their time in the Navy, enjoy life, living around the country. But Carter wrote in 2021, we had stayed at all these bases throughout my time in the Navy, but Plains was always my home. And so after his father passed away, they made that difficult decision to go back down there to Plains to become a peanut farmer that, as the legend goes, right, that he was this peanut farmer. And so it just says a lot about Jimmy Carter coming back here to Georgia after really staring down the face of an illustrious career in the Navy, giving all that up to come back here and take over the family business. But all that to say that the Navy was a massive part of his life, so they will be taking him past that memorial a little later on today before the hearse is switched out for a horse-drawn carriage. That will take him the rest of the way up Pennsylvania Avenue to the Capitol. It's literally steps. If you stand at the Navy Memorial on Pennsylvania Avenue and look up the street, you can't see just about anything but the U.S. Capitol, so it's right there. It will be a short procession, but we can certainly expect it to be an emotional one, and maybe a little closer to those images that we're used to seeing of presidential funerals, with those horse-drawn carriages, people walking on foot beside it. And so all we're essentially waiting for now is for these planes to taxi and to take off, and they're going to, we suspect, do it right over our heads when they leave. This is, again, about a several-hour flight, maybe a little over 2-hour flight from here to D.C. When you take it commercially, it'll be about the same for President Carter. He's expected to land there, give or take, around 1:30, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and they will do all of this, guys, again, in reverse when they get there to join Andrews Base in Maryland. So again, this will be a chance for people in Washington, D.C. To come and see this little bit more of a formal setting, because I know, as Lana mentioned, typically Carter would be lying in state at the Georgia Capitol, but it was his decision, it was his desire to lie in state, or in repose, at the Carter Center, because that was a place that was so close to him and his wife throughout their life. They even kept an apartment there at the Carter Center where they would spend about 1 week out of every month just getting to know the staff, kind of going over how things were going with some of their initiatives, whether it be on free and fair elections across the world, curing tropical diseases like guinea worm, everything that they did there at the Carter Center. Jimmy and Rosalind really had a big hand in. So this whole ceremony from start to finish has had Carter's fingerprints all over it. It's been very unique, and yes, there is a lot of pomp and circumstance when it comes to these types of things. There's certain things that have to be done a certain way every time, but this ceremony truly was really unique to Carter for so many reasons. And so, even Carter, again, as we mentioned, served in the Navy. He has the option, because he was a veteran of our country, to be buried at Arlington National Cemetery. He instead decided to be buried on the grounds of his family home in Plains. And so, he was always the type of guy that he was. That has continued in death, guys. And so as we wait for these planes to take off, we'll be out here, we'll keep you updated, but we'll send it back to you for now.
All right, Doug, thanks very much for all of that. And this event taking place that we've just witnessed, really military precision, as we watched different military bands and all the protocol that took place, accompanying and leading to the former president being placed onto that aircraft for this trip to Washington, D.C. And it was really planned out to the minute.
Right.
Except that Mother Nature intervened earlier today and caused the organizers of these events to sort of push them back a couple of hours. And so this is happening slightly later than what was originally planned, because of the weather in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, organizers wanted to give crews in D.C. a little extra time to clear the roadways. They were very nasty out there. First Alert meteorologist Courtney Jacobazi is actually here to talk about it. Yeah. So, Courtney, we've literally seen Mother Nature have a say in today's events that have been planned for years.
Absolutely. And you can see, if you kind of squint your eyes in that live look there, in Washington, D.C., some of the snowflakes still falling there, flurries falling from the sky. I mean, a winter wonderland there. It looks beautiful. But of course, a winter storm moved through yesterday, giving record snowfall to parts of the D.C. area. They picked up between about 6 to 10 inches of snow. I also looked at some of the observations from the city from yesterday's weather, and it looked like they had some light freezing rain, which of course puts ice on the roadways between about 3 and 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon. So that obviously a huge concern, and you can see the snow still blanketing there. Temperatures in Washington right now still sitting below freezing. They'll stay about below freezing throughout the entire day. So as the Carter family leaves a very cold Atlanta, cold Marietta, they are going to be greeted with an even colder DC. Of course, a beautiful look though, just a gorgeous blanket of snow there in the city. But of course, they had to have crews go out and clear the roadways, so the crews needed that time, especially with the record snowfall. They couldn't go out during the event. The event created blankets of snow and sheets of snow falling across the city. So after everything finally dwindled down very, very early this morning, crews were able to go out, but naturally just out of a precaution, of course, for safety for the family and for the entire procession, they needed to delay things a few hours in order to get those roadways cleared. But right now in D.C., very, very cold. Thankfully, on Thursday, when President Jimmy Carter and the family comes home, they will be greeted with beautiful weather for a beautiful final ceremony here in Plains to celebrate what was ultimately his really beautiful life.
Thank you, Courtney. And as you can see there on the left, the presidential aircraft is beginning to taxi, beginning to move, and beginning to get ready to take off from Dobbins on its way to Andrews Air Force Base in Maryland. Again, that plane carrying the remains of the former president and his family. As we watch these live pictures coming to us now, this was a plane that was sent by President Biden when he declared a period of national mourning, a 30-day period of national mourning after it was announced that President Carter had died. And this is one of the ways that President Biden wanted to honor his friend Jimmy Carter, someone he had a long history with, by sending this jet to accompany to bring him back to Washington for the ceremonies that will take place in Washington over the next couple of days, and then to return him back to Georgia for his burial on Thursday. Again, this is an airplane that has been dubbed a special Air Mission 39 in honor of the fact that President Carter was the 39th president of the United States.
So it's a little bit ahead of schedule, just by about 1 minute. So that's that precision we're talking about here. So 12:45 is when it was projected to depart for Washington, which is happening live on air as we speak. It's expected to get to Maryland, to Joint Base Andrews, around 2:15. And then at 2:45, that motorcade will depart for the U.S. Navy Memorial. And we have had extensive coverage on former President Jimmy Carter. You just heard Doug Reardon say it himself there, mentioning his time in the Navy. It's very important to the former president's life. He graduated from the Naval Academy in 1946. But in 2005, the U.S. Navy actually christened the last of its Seawolf-class nuclear-powered fast attack submarine, the USS Jimmy Carter. So that's why they're stopping there first. This was a pivotal part of the former president's life. So from there, at 3:30, that motorcade will arrive at the U.S. Navy Memorial, and his remains will be transferred from a hearse to a horse-drawn caisson.
That's right. Sorry about that noise there in the background. But you talk about how, and Doug talked about how President Carter's sort of stamp is all over these events that are being carried out today. Right. And he did, of course, have a lot of input in what we are watching unfold. But then there are traditions that are in place, that would be in place for any former president. And we should mention that when the president's casket is driven to the U.S. Capitol building, it will sit on a caisson that was the same caisson that carried the body of Abraham Lincoln. after his assassination in 1865. And so there are a number of traditions that are being carried out and followed today as we watch these events unfold. Really history in the making as we say goodbye to the 39th president of the United States, the only president to have hailed from the state of Georgia. So a very special significance for people here in our state as we say goodbye to this man who meant so much, not just to the people here in Georgia, but to people around the country and around the world as we watch. And let's just be quiet here and watch the liftoff, the takeoff of Special Air Mission 39, carrying the late President Jimmy Carter. There is. And there it is, flying off into the distance, getting smaller and smaller on our screen, heading north to Andrews Air Force Base in Washington for a series of events that will take place there over the next couple of days. The former president will lie in state under the Capitol Rotunda. There'll be a service this afternoon that will feature speeches from Vice President Kamala Harris, the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, and the Senate Majority Leader, John Thune, all there to honor the late president. He will then lie in state under the rotunda where the general public will be able to come and pay their respects, much as they were able to at the Carter Center here in Atlanta over the last couple of days. And then Thursday morning, the president's casket will be moved from the Capitol building to the National Cathedral for his memorial service, where there will be a number of eulogies delivered, including eulogy from President Biden, in addition to 2 eulogies that will be read by the relatives of the men who wrote them, because the men who wrote them are no longer with us. Walter Mondale, who was Jimmy Carter's vice president, he wrote a eulogy that will be read by his son. And the man who President Carter beat in order to get to the White House, Gerald Ford's son, will read a eulogy that was written by the late President Ford before he died. And so we'll be hearing some voices from the past, but very significant voices, all in remembrance and in tribute to a great American who died last week at the age of 100.
And we appreciate you watching this historic moment along with us. This was the last time the former President Jimmy Carter will leave the state of Georgia. But remember that we have so much coverage on his life and his legacy, and of course his funeral services on our website and our app. It's the Atlanta News First app. You can also watch us streaming live on ANF Plus, Atlanta News First Plus. You can find that anywhere you stream: Roku, Fire TV, Apple TV, and YouTube.